People always assume that calm means empty. Like if you're not throwing your weight around, if you're not the loudest voice in the room, if you don't drive a truck with a lift kit and argue about sports like your identity depends on it, then you must be soft, hollow, background noise. I've heard it my whole life, in different forms. From coaches who thought intensity meant volume, from guys at bars who mistook silence for submission, and now, apparently, from my wife. But let me back up. My name is Grant Holloway. I'm 34 years old. I wake up at 5:47 every morning without an alarm. Not because I'm disciplined in some performative way, just because my body decided years ago that sleep was a negotiable resource. I make coffee, read for 40 minutes, go to work. I'm a senior analyst at a logistics consulting firm, which is exactly as interesting as it sounds to most people, and exactly as fascinating as it actually is to me. I like systems. I like understanding how things connect, what breaks under pressure, and what holds. I live in a clean house in a quiet neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. Nice street. Good neighbors who wave but don't overstay conversations. The kind of block where the HOA emails are annoying but the crime rate is low. I have a wife named Sabrina. We've been married for 2 years. She's beautiful in the way that makes a room rearrange itself when she walks in. Dark hair, easy smile, the kind of confidence that fills space without trying. When we met, I thought she was the most alive person I'd ever seen. I still think that. I'm just starting to wonder if that energy needs to feed on something, and whether I've ever been enough fuel. By most accounts, my life is stable, enviable even. Good income, no debt worth mentioning, a home we own before 40, a marriage that, from the outside, looks like a postcard. And I think that's the problem. I suspected people found me gentle, too even-keeled, too reasonable. The guy who doesn't raise his voice in arguments, the guy who listens before speaking, the guy who solves problems instead of performing emotions about them. I thought that was a virtue. I was wrong. Or at least, not everyone saw it that way. The first crack came on a Tuesday. I was coming down the hallway, sock feet on hardwood, completely silent, not by design, just habit. And Sabrina was in the kitchen with Lindsay on speakerphone. Maybe Naomi too, I wasn't sure. I caught maybe 8 seconds of conversation before I registered I was hearing something I wasn't supposed to. He's just so soft. Like I love him, but there's no fire, no edge. It's like being married to a cloud, or a doormat. A very reliable, polite cloud. A very comfortable doormat. I stopped. I stood there in the hallway for maybe 3 seconds. Processed it. Then I walked back to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall. A cloud. A doormat. I've been called a lot of things. Those were new. Here's the thing. I didn't spiral. That's not how I'm wired. I don't catastrophize. I cataloged. Pulled it apart like a sentence in a report. She feels something is missing. She framed it as a flaw in me. She said it to Lindsay, which means it's not a passing thought. It's a consensus opinion being workshopped among her friends. I filed it, noted the variables, and I let it sit. I told myself it was probably nothing. Everyone vents. Marriages have friction. 2 years in is exactly when the initial electricity starts leveling out and people start confusing stability with stagnation. I'd read enough to know that, so I let it go. I probably shouldn't have. 3 days later, I got a call from Brooke. Brooke Dalton is one of Sabrina's friends, the one I actually like. Not in any complicated way, just in the way you like someone who seems to be operating from a different moral framework than the rest of the group. She laughs at things that are actually funny. She doesn't perform opinions. She's the only one in that circle who ever asks me a question and then waits for the full answer. She called from what sounded like a parking lot. Wind in the microphone. Grant. Hey, I need to tell you something and I need you to not make it weird. Okay. They're throwing a party at your house tonight, like they're already planning it. Lindsay's idea. Sabrina went along with it. I sat with that for a second. A party. A party. But that's not the part you need to hear. She paused. I could tell she was choosing her words carefully, which is not something Brooke usually has to do. They invited Derek Vance. The name meant nothing to me for about 2 seconds. Then Sabrina had mentioned him once, maybe 8 months ago, an ex, briefly before we met. She'd described him as a phase. The way people describe things they're not proud of, but also not entirely ready to dismiss. Grant, this isn't just a party. I think they want to see how you react. To him, to the whole thing. Lindsay called it a test. I didn't say anything for a moment. I know this is insane, Brooke said. I told them it was insane. Nobody listened. I'm sorry. You deserve to know. Don't apologize, I said. You're the only one in this situation behaving like an adult. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. What are you going to do? I thought about it, genuinely thought about it, the way I think about anything, not from the gut, but from the full picture. What this meant, what the variables were, what the smartest move looked like from every angle. I'm going to go home, I said. Grant, I'm going to go home, Brooke. Thank you. Really. I hung up and sat in my car for 11 minutes. Here's what I felt, if I'm being honest. Not rage. Not even hurt, exactly. It was more like that specific feeling you get when something you half suspected turns out to be true. A kind of grim, quiet confirmation. Like watching a structural report come back and realizing the thing you thought was load-bearing wasn't. 2 years of marriage, and she wanted to run a test. Fine. I know how tests work. I've taken harder ones than this. There's something I don't talk about much. Not at dinner parties, not with colleagues, not even with Sabrina, really. It's not a secret exactly. It's just not relevant. Usually, when I was 22, I went through a training program. I won't get too specific. Let's say it was the kind of preparation you do when you're seriously considering a career that involves government work, clearances, and the kind of skill sets that don't show up on a normal resume. Physical, psychological, tactical. I was good at it. I was genuinely, quietly, almost unsettlingly good at it. And then, about 8 months in, I made a decision. Not because I couldn't handle it, not because I failed anything. I just sat down one afternoon and thought, I don't want to spend my life working for a machine I don't fully trust. Simple as that. I walked away, filed the paperwork. Nobody fought me on it. I took the skills, left the uniform. Most people look at me and see a polite guy in a good watch who holds the door open and makes his points in meetings without raising his voice. They see the cloud, or worse, the doormat. They don't see the 12 years of keeping my body in the kind of shape that doesn't advertise itself. They don't see the way I read a room, not socially, but tactically. They don't see the part of my brain that is constantly, quietly, running the math. I'm not dangerous. I want to be clear about that. I'm not looking for conflict, but I have never, not once, been afraid of it. I drove home. The driveway already had 3 cars I didn't recognize. I sat in my own car, parked on the street, and looked at the lights on in my own house. Music I could hear from outside. Laughter. The whole performance already in motion. I checked my watch, fixed my collar, took one slow breath. Okay, I thought. Let's see what you've got. Cloud. Doormat. We'll see which one walks through that door. The first thing that hit me was the music. Something with too much bass and not enough purpose. The kind of playlist that gets assembled by committee and ends up pleasing nobody completely, but offending nobody enough to change it. Bottles on my kitchen counter. A cheese board that Sabrina clearly put together in a hurry because the crackers were still in the sleeve. 4, maybe 5 people in the living room. Another 2 hovering near the back door with drinks. My house, my furniture, my Tuesday evening. Sabrina spotted me from across the room and I watched something flicker across her face. Guilt, excitement, a quick calculation, before it settled into a practiced smile. Hey babe, surprise I know. Lindsay kind of just showed up with everyone and it turned into a whole thing. Don't worry about it, I said, and I meant it in exactly the way she couldn't tell whether I meant it. I kissed her cheek. She smelled like wine and nerves. I set my bag down by the stairs, rolled up my sleeves one fold, and went to the kitchen to pour myself a drink. Slowly. No rush. I said hello to Naomi, who gave me a smile that was slightly too warm to be genuine. I nodded at Claire, who was sitting in the corner armchair doing what Claire always does, watching everything and saying nothing, like a security camera with better taste. Lindsay caught my eye from across the room and raised her glass. "Grant, didn't think you'd make it home so early." "It's my home, Lindsay." She laughed like that was the funniest thing she'd heard all week. Maybe it was. I found a spot near the kitchen island. Good sightlines. Not in the center of anything. Close enough to the action to observe without being in it. I sipped my drink. I listened. I started building the map. He came in about 20 minutes after me. I heard him before I saw him. A laugh that was calibrated to fill a space 2 sizes larger than the room it was in. The kind of laugh that announces I have arrived and you should feel lucky about that. Then the door, and then Derek Vance. I'll give the man this. He was physically impressive in the way that a golden retriever is physically impressive. Big, loud, takes up more space than strictly necessary, clearly expects to be the favorite. 6'2", maybe 6'3". Broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested either serious gym time or serious genetics, probably both. He had one of those faces that was probably handsome 10 years ago and was now coasting on the memory of it. A jawline doing overtime. A shirt that fit like a second opinion. He scanned the room the way people do when they want to confirm everyone noticed them enter. Then his eyes landed on Sabrina and he grinned. Wide, easy, proprietary, and crossed the room to hug her. Not a friend hug. The other kind. "Brina," he said, like the name belonged to him. Sabrina laughed and hugged him back and said something I didn't catch. Then she turned slightly, like she remembered she was supposed to do something, and said, "Oh, this is Grant, my husband." The pause before husband was maybe half a second too long. Derek turned and looked at me. Really looked, the way men do when they're taking a measurement, not making a connection. "Hey man," he extended a hand, firm grip, held a beat too long, which is the handshake equivalent of a guy revving his engine at a red light. "Derek." "Grant," I said. "Good grip." He blinked. Wasn't sure if I was complimenting him or noting it clinically. I wasn't sure either, honestly. Sabrina didn't introduce him as her ex. She didn't say old friend either. She let it just sit there, undefined, which told me everything about how carefully this whole thing had been constructed. Nobody confirmed it. Nobody denied it. It was information floating in the room like smoke. Present, impossible to ignore. Technically, nobody's fault. Lindsay, to her credit, couldn't help herself. She drifted over within 5 minutes and said casually, to nobody in particular, "Derek and Sabrina go way back, like way, way back." She smiled at me when she said it. I smiled back. "Small world," I said, and went to refresh my drink. Here's the thing about deciding not to react. It's not the same as not feeling anything. I felt plenty. I registered the way Sabrina's body language shifted when Derek was in the room. Loose, animated, the kind of easy she got when she felt electric. I registered that she hadn't touched me since I walked in. I registered every moment she laughed at something Derek said before he finished saying it. I cataloged all of it, filed it, did not perform a single emotion about any of it. Instead, I became the world's most attentive host. I topped off drinks. I found the good bourbon and put it on the counter without being asked. I asked Naomi about her sister's thing in Portland, which she'd mentioned 6 weeks ago, and watched her look genuinely surprised that I remembered. I asked Claire if the armchair was comfortable enough, and she said yes, and then looked at me for a second longer than necessary, like she was adjusting a first impression. I was pleasant. I was present. I was watching everything. Brooke arrived around 8:30. She walked in, clocked me immediately, and the relief on her face was subtle but real. She came over and stood next to me at the kitchen counter. "You're smiling," she said quietly, like it concerned her. Should I not be? You look like someone who's already read the last chapter. I didn't answer that. Just handed her a glass of wine. I'd already poured it because I'd seen her come in, and I know she drinks Pinot Grigio when she's stressed. And she took it without making a thing out of the fact that I'd known. "Is this okay?" she asked. "Define okay?" She gave me a look. "Grant." "I'm fine, Brooke. Genuinely." I paused. "Thank you for calling." She nodded once and didn't push it, which is one of the things I respect about her. She knows when a conversation is complete. Derek found his rhythm about an hour in. He was on his third drink. I'd counted. And that's when the filter comes off for guys like him. Not mean yet, just unguarded. Which is when you see the real architecture of a person. He had positioned himself at the center of the living room like a host at his own party. Lindsay was laughing at everything he said. Naomi kept touching his arm when she made a point, which was either flirtation or habit. Claire watched from the corner with the expression of someone who had already formed a conclusion. Sabrina was next to him on the couch. She hadn't sat next to me all evening. Derek was holding court, telling some story about a camping trip that seemed to have no plot but several punchlines, and I was standing near the bookshelf, and he looked over at me mid-sentence and said, "You camp, Grant?" "When I was younger," I said. "What happened? Got too comfortable?" He grinned, not a mean grin exactly. A testing grin. "I just got more selective about when it's worth being uncomfortable," I said. A beat. He didn't quite know what to do with that, so he laughed and kept going. The first probe was complete. I had what I needed. 20 minutes later, he was fully into it. He had opinions, many of them. He had opinions about the gym, about diets, about how men today had lost something essential that men of previous generations understood instinctively. He used the word alpha without irony, which I filed under confirmed. He said women needed leadership from a man, not partnership, and he said it with the confidence of someone who has never once had that theory pressure tested by an actual adult woman. Lindsay was nodding enthusiastically. Of course she was. Naomi offered, "There's actually some psychology research on dominance and attraction, like primal stuff." "Exactly," Derek said, pointing at her. "Exactly. It's primal. It's science." I set my glass down. "What kind of research?" I asked. Naomi blinked. "Sorry?" "The psychology research. What are you referring to specifically?" She opened her mouth, then closed it, then said something about evolutionary biology that trailed off into a hum. "Right," I said pleasantly, and I left it there. Derek looked at me. I could feel him recalibrating. I wasn't performing threat, so he didn't know whether I was a challenge or a footnote. He went back to his story. But something had shifted, and we both knew it. The room was watching. Brooke caught my eye from across the room. She raised an eyebrow by maybe 2 millimeters. I gave her nothing back, just a small, unhurried sip of my drink. Not yet, I thought. Not yet. There's a specific moment in any conversation where the other person stops talking to you and starts talking at you. Derek hit that threshold around his 4th drink. He was leaning back in my armchair, the one I'd had since before the marriage, the one that took 3 months to break in properly, with his legs spread wide and one arm draped over the side like he was posing for a magazine called Men Who Take Up Space Monthly. He was in the middle of explaining, unprompted, his philosophy on relationships. "See, the problem with guys today," he said, gesturing with his drink, "is they're too worried about feelings. Their girls' feelings, their own feelings. Bro, just be the man. Lead. Stop asking permission for everything." Lindsay nodded like he was reading from scripture. Naomi said, in that way she has. Not agreement exactly, more like she's taking notes for a thesis she'll never write. Sabrina was quiet. She was watching Derek, but she kept glancing at me in a way that I couldn't fully classify. Checking my temperature maybe, waiting for something. I let the silence sit for a second after he finished. Then I said, "Can I ask you something?" Derek looked over. "Sure, man." "When you say lead, what does that actually look like? Day to day, specifically." He shrugged like it was obvious. You make the calls. You don't second-guess yourself. Your woman knows you're solid. Okay, I said. And what do you do when you're wrong? A pause. What? When you make the call and it turns out to be the wrong one? What's the leadership move there? He shifted slightly. You own it and move on. Sure. And does she get input before the next call? Or is the model that you decide and she adjusts? She trusts you to decide. Based on what, though? Like, what does she have to evaluate to build that trust? Just the fact that you're confident? The room was quieter now. I hadn't raised my voice. I was genuinely asking, in the tone of someone curious, which is the most disarming tone there is because people don't know whether to defend themselves or just answer. Derek's jaw tightened slightly. It's about respect, man. You either have it or you don't. Sure, how do you earn it, though? By being a man. Right, but... I tilted my head slightly. That's circular. Being a man earns respect, and you know you're being a man because you have respect. I'm trying to find the actual mechanism. Lindsay had stopped nodding. Naomi was looking at her drink. Claire in the corner had gone very still. Derek laughed. The kind of laugh that's really just a sound you make when you need a second. You always this analytical about everything? Mostly, yeah, I said. Occupational hazard. He recovered. I gave him room to. That's the thing people don't understand about this kind of conversation. You don't win by pressing every advantage. You win by knowing when to ease off, let the other person breathe, feel okay again, and then you ask the next question. I topped off his drink myself. He took it. The gesture reset something. He thought he'd navigated the weird moment, that it was over. He leaned back into his performance, which is when I asked about his personal life. You got kids, Derek? Something moved across his face. Fast. Yeah, one. A daughter. That's great. How old? 6. You see her much? The room temperature dropped about 2 degrees. I see her, he said, clipped. Of course. Neutral. Not pressing, just present. You and her mom still in Columbus? We're not together. Gotcha. I nodded slowly, like I was just catching up. So you're co-parenting. Something like that. That's hard, I said, and I meant it genuinely, which somehow made it worse for him. Doing the relationship thing after a split with a kid involved, respect for navigating that. He didn't know what to do with sincerity. It was like handing someone a document in a language they almost speak. Yeah, well, he said, I manage. I've got women lined up, so. He tried to make it land as a brag. It didn't. Lindsay made a small sound that was supposed to be impressed and came out uncertain. Naomi looked at the ceiling for a moment. Sabrina, I noticed, had gone very quiet. Nice, I said simply, and took a sip. The silence stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. Just long enough for everyone to hear what he'd actually said. I have a 6-year-old I co-parent, and my argument for masculine success is that I have dating options. Played back at them in the echo of the room. Claire looked at me. It was a quick look, assessing. Like someone who'd walked into a room expecting a still life and found a chess match already in progress. She looked away before I noticed she was looking. Except I'd already noticed. Derek felt it. The slow erosion of the ground he'd been standing on. Men like him have good instincts about one thing, when they're losing an audience. And when they feel it, they don't recalibrate. They escalate. He leaned forward. You know what your problem is, Grant? Tell me, I said. You think too much. Women don't want a guy who analyzes everything to death. They want a guy who acts, who's present, physical, real. He said it with complete confidence, gesturing towards Sabrina without looking at her. No offense. None taken, I said. Like, you seem like a good guy. Smart, whatever. But smart doesn't keep a woman interested. You know what I mean? I think I'm starting to. He leaned back, satisfied. He thought that landed. In his defense, it was the best argument he had. That's why I work out, he continued. Discipline, physical presence. Women respond to that, whether they admit it or not. It's biological. How long have you been training? I asked. 8 years, serious, since college. I nodded. What's your deadlift? He told me. It was a decent number. He was waiting for me to be impressed. Good, I said. Consistent program? 5 days a week. Never miss. Nice discipline, I said. And then, very casually, I said nothing else. He frowned. He'd expected either challenge or deference. He got neither. What do you lift? He asked. I don't really track numbers anymore. He laughed. So, nothing serious. Sure, I said agreeably. The thing about a slow burn is that most people don't recognize it until they're already warm. Derek was warm. He just thought he was comfortable. He'd been chipping at me for 20 minutes, not viciously, but steadily. Little comments, guys like you, office types, too much in your head. He touched Sabrina's shoulder twice in that window, drifted into her space in a way that was technically just friendly and practically a statement. Sabrina let it happen. Each time, I made a small internal note, added it to the file. The file was getting thick. Brooke had moved to the kitchen. I could feel her not watching, which is different from not paying attention. She was giving me space and staying close enough to matter. I appreciated that more than I said. Lindsay, meanwhile, had gotten bored of subtlety. Derek, tell Grant about that time you stopped that guy outside the bar, she said brightly, setting something up. Derek grinned. The story was exactly what you'd expect. A confrontation. A guy who'd backed down. Derek as the immovable protagonist. He told it well. I'll give him that. Good pacing, punchy ending. When he finished, everyone laughed. He looked at me. What would you have done? He asked. In that situation? Yeah. I thought about it for a genuine second. Probably talked to him first. Figured out what he actually wanted. Derek snorted. Talked. Usually works, I said. And if it didn't? I looked at him. Then it didn't. Something in my tone, not threatening, just completely unbothered, made him pause, just briefly. His eyes did a quick, involuntary thing where they moved down to my shoulders and arms and then back up, reassessing. Most people don't catch themselves doing it. He didn't catch himself either. I caught him doing it. I kept my face exactly the same. The shift happened around 9:45. Derek had run out of philosophical ground to hold, and he knew it, even if he couldn't articulate why. The conversation had made him look, not stupid exactly, but imprecise. Like someone who'd brought a megaphone to a debate and kept talking louder instead of making better points. He needed something physical. Guys like Derek always do. When the words stop working, they go looking for a different currency. He stretched his arms above his head, a display, not a stretch, and said to the room, "Man, I need to do something. I've been sitting too long." Then he looked at me with a grin that had too many teeth in it. "Hey, Grant, you ever arm wrestle?" Lindsay's eyes lit up. Naomi sat up slightly. Sabrina went very still. "Not recently," I said. "Want to? Just for fun, no big deal." He held up his hands like totally casual. "Unless you're worried." He smiled when he said it. Easy, relaxed, already celebrating. "I'm not worried," I said. I set down my glass, looked at him. "Sure, why not?" The room rearranged itself the way rooms do when something's about to happen. People shifted, straightened, stopped their side conversations. Brooke appeared in the kitchen doorway. Claire put her phone down for the first time all evening. Sabrina's cheeks were flushed. She was gripping her wine glass with both hands. Derek was rolling up his sleeve, showing the kind of forearm that has its own postal code. He sat at the dining table and planted his elbow like he was staking a flag. I pulled out the chair across from him. I slipped my watch off, a simple, unhurried motion, and set it on the table beside me. Derek looked at it, then at me. "You sure about this, man? I'll go easy." He grinned at the room. "Don't want to embarrass anyone." A couple of people laughed. Lindsay definitely did. "That's thoughtful," I said. I placed my elbow on the table. There's something clarifying about a moment that has no more moving parts, no subtext, No social strategy, no reading between lines, just two people, a table, and a question that's been floating in the room all evening finally asking itself out loud. I looked at Derek's hand. Big, wide, the kind of hand that looks like it was built for exactly this. Thick fingers, prominent knuckles, a wrist that probably had its own gym membership. He was 30 pounds heavier than me at minimum. I'd estimated it the moment he walked in, the same way I estimate distances and exits and the tensile logic of any room I enter. It's not paranoia. It's just how my brain runs in the background. He gripped my hand and immediately did what overconfident people always do. Applied about 60% of his force before the signal, a preload, trying to establish psychological advantage before the contest even starts. I felt it, absorbed it, didn't move. His eyes flickered. Just slightly. "Ready?" Lindsay said, leaning forward with the excitement of someone who had engineered this moment and wanted front-row seats to the result. "Sure," I said. Someone counted down. I wasn't really listening. Here's what nobody in that room knew about me. When I was 22 and going through the program, there was an instructor. Older guy, maybe 55, built like a fire hydrant, hands like geological formations. He didn't look like much until you touched him. And then you understood immediately that you'd made an error in your initial assessment. He taught a session on applied leverage, biomechanics of resistance, how force actually moves through a chain of joints, and why mass by itself is a limited variable. "Strength is a story you tell with your body," he said once, in that flat, unhurried way he had. Most people tell it loudly. The ones who know what they're doing tell it quietly, at exactly the right moment. I was good at that session, better than I expected. I hadn't forgotten any of it. The signal came. Derek engaged. Full commitment. Immediate. The way a guy does when he's certain of the outcome and wants to end it fast so everyone can applaud him. I let him move my hand about 15 degrees. That's the first thing people don't expect. When you don't resist the initial surge, when you absorb it instead of fighting it, they read it as weakness and they push harder. They overcommit. They lean in. They let their shoulder drop. They sacrifice their base for their momentum. Derek leaned in. I felt his mechanics shift. His elbow lifted a fraction. His shoulder rotated past optimal. His grip tightened in a way that actually reduced his effective leverage. He was strong. Genuinely, impressively strong. Under normal circumstances, against a normal opponent, this would have been over in 4 seconds. These weren't normal circumstances. I repositioned my wrist by maybe 10 degrees, changed the angle of engagement, applied pressure not against his force, but perpendicular to it, redirecting the chain. His momentum had nowhere to go. I felt him recalibrate, try to find the wall he'd been expecting. There wasn't one, just that quiet, steady, completely unmovable resistance that has nothing to do with how much you bench, and everything to do with how well you understand the geometry of the thing. He pushed harder. I didn't. I just held, like something that had been there a long time and wasn't planning to move. The room started to notice. It had been maybe 8 seconds, which doesn't sound like much, but in arm wrestling, 8 seconds is a geological epic. By that point, Derek should have been celebrating. Instead, he was red in the face. Not the healthy pink of exertion, but the dark, unhappy flush of a man who has publicly committed to an outcome that isn't happening. I heard Lindsay make a small sound. Not a laugh. Something more confused. Naomi had both hands over her mouth. Brooke, in the doorway, was very still. Sabrina. I glanced at her for exactly 1 second. Just one. She was leaning forward, both hands wrapped around her wine glass, knuckles slightly white. Her lips were parted. She looked like someone watching a movie that had taken an unexpected turn, and she was no longer sure she understood the genre. I looked back at Derek. His jaw was clenched. A vein along his temple had become a visible structural feature. He was making a sound that wasn't quite a grunt. Something lower, more private. The sound a man makes when he's spending currency he didn't know he was going to need. "Take your time," I said, quietly, almost gently. His eyes snapped to mine and I saw it. The exact moment a man stops being confident and starts being scared. Not of losing, of what losing means, of the whole narrative he'd walked in with, the whole architecture of the evening suddenly showing its weight-bearing walls. I exhaled slowly, rotated my shoulder by a fraction, changed the fulcrum, and then I put his hand down, not fast, not dramatic, just down. Steady and inevitable, like a door closing. His knuckles hit the table with a sound that was louder than I expected, which meant he'd been fighting it until the very last degree. The silence lasted maybe 2 full seconds. Then everyone exhaled at once. Claire said nothing, but she was looking at me with an expression I can only describe as recalibration, like she'd been running a model, and the output didn't match the prediction, and she was quietly updating her assumptions. Naomi said, "Oh my God." Lindsay said nothing, which was the most surprising thing she'd done all evening. Brooke, in the doorway, looked at her wine glass and took a slow sip and said nothing at all, which meant she was either very pleased or very emotional, or both. Sabrina made a sound, barely audible, somewhere between a breath and a word, and then pressed her fingers to her lips. I released Derek's hand. I picked up my watch from the table and put it back on, buckled the strap. One motion, unhurried. Derek sat there for about 4 seconds. Then he stood up. Too fast. The chair scraped back hard and he grabbed his drink off the table, took a long pull from it, and set it back down with more force than the glass deserved. "Good grip," he said, flat. The compliment I'd given him at the door returned with interest. "Thanks," I said. He rolled his sleeve down. He was trying to look composed, and he was almost managing it, which I respected in a technical sense. Then Lindsay said something. I didn't catch it, just the tone, something light and slightly pointed, and Derek's composure cracked at exactly the wrong moment. "You know what? Whatever," he said, too loud. "Party trick. Doesn't mean anything." "Sure," I said. "I've seen guys do that whole leverage thing. It's a trick." "Yep," I agreed, pleasantly. He didn't know what to do with that either. The argument requires a wall to push against, and I kept not being one. He stepped toward me. Not a lunge, not exactly, but a step with intention. The step of a man who has run out of vocabulary and is considering a different language. I didn't step back. I didn't move at all. What I did was shift my weight, barely perceptibly, just a small redistribution of where I was standing. And it was the kind of movement that only means something if you know what it means. A door being unlocked. An option being made available. Derek knew what it meant. His body understood before his brain caught up. He pulled up short. Something went out of his posture, not gradually, all at once, like air from a valve. He blinked. Then he laughed, a short, unconvincing sound, and said, "Nah, I'm good. I'm done." He picked up his jacket from the couch. He grabbed his drink, finished it, set the glass down on the wrong surface, my coffee table, not a coaster, which was the last petty thing he had available to him. He said his goodbyes in the way of a man who is trying to leave a room with more dignity than the room is currently willing to offer. He pointed at Sabrina and said, "Good seeing you, Brina," in a voice that tried for casual and landed somewhere near strained. He turned to go. His foot caught the edge of the area rug. Not a full fall, just a stumble, a graceless lurch forward, one hand slapping the wall for balance. It lasted maybe 1 second. It felt much longer. Nobody laughed. The room was too shocked, or too kind, or both. He straightened up, didn't look back, and walked out my front door. The party wound down in the way things do after a defining moment, quickly and with minimal eye contact. People found their coats. Lindsay made her goodbyes short and uncharacteristically quiet. Naomi hugged Sabrina and threw me a glance that I couldn't fully classify, somewhere between impressed and unsettled, like she'd just watched a nature documentary take an unexpected turn. Claire paused at the door. She looked at me for a moment. Really looked. The way she'd been doing all evening from a distance, except now close up. She didn't say anything specific. Just, "Good night, Grant." The way she said my name, like she'd revised what it meant sometime in the last hour. Night, Claire. Brooke was the last to leave. She helped carry a few glasses to the kitchen without being asked. When she was done, she stood near the counter and looked at me. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah." She nodded slowly. "The watch thing," she said. "When you took it off and put it back on after. That was—" She stopped, made a small gesture with her hand that meant I don't have the right word, but you know the word. "Old habit," I said. She looked at me for one more second. Then she picked up her bag and said, "For what it's worth, and I know you didn't need anyone to say this, you were the best person in this room tonight. By a lot." She left before I could respond, which was fine. I didn't have a response. I just stood there in my own kitchen, in the quiet that had finally settled over my house, and I held that sentence for a moment. Then I set it down carefully, in the same file where I keep the things that matter. Sabrina was behind me. I hadn't heard her come in. She moves quietly when she's uncertain. I've noticed that. The heels come off. The footsteps go soft. It's her version of approach with caution. "Grant," she said. I turned around. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, barefoot on the tile, her wine glass empty, her eyes bright with something that was part adrenaline and part something else I wasn't ready to name yet. She was smiling. It was the smile I'd fallen in love with. "I didn't know," she said. Her voice had gone low, soft, the register she uses when she wants something. "I had no idea you could. I mean, I knew you were, but I never thought—" She stopped, took one step toward me. "You were incredible tonight," she said. I looked at her, and I thought about the file. The kitchen was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a neighbor's car door closing. The house felt hollow, as if the air had been sucked out along with the guests. Sabrina took another step closer, her eyes locked on mine. There was a flush in her cheeks that hadn't been there 2 hours ago. It wasn't the wine, it was the high. She was vibrating with the reflected glory of a spectacle she had orchestrated. "Grant," she said again, her voice dropping into that intimate velvet register. I've never seen you like that. You were so in control. The way you looked at him, I didn't know you had that in you." She reached out to touch my arm, her fingers trailing over the sleeve I'd just rolled back down. She was looking at me like I was a new piece of furniture she'd finally decided she liked. The cloud had produced a lightning strike, and she was basking in the ozone. I didn't move. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. I just looked at her and opened the file. "You didn't know I had what in me, Sabrina?" I asked. My voice was as level as it had been when I was discussing logistics at 10 a.m. "That fire," she whispered. "That edge. Honestly, I thought you'd just let him talk. But you stood your ground. You broke him." "I didn't break him," I said. "I just stopped playing the part you assigned me." I looked past her into the living room. My armchair was empty. The coasters were scattered. The house was a mess, and so was the structure of my marriage. "You invited him here to see if I'd fold?" I said. It wasn't a question. "You, Lindsay, and the rest of them. You wanted to see if the doormat would let Derek Vance wipe his boots on it." The smile on her face faltered, just a fraction. "No, Grant, it wasn't like that. We were just having fun. I just wanted to see you stand up for yourself. For us." "I stand up for us every day," I said. "I do it by making sure the bills are paid, the house is safe, and your life is stable enough that you have the luxury of getting bored. I thought that was the job. I didn't realize the job required a physical demonstration for an audience." I thought about Brooke. I thought about her voice in the wind, telling me I deserved to know. Brooke didn't need to see me pin a man's arm to a table to know I was the best person in the room. She had seen it in the way I poured her wine and the way I kept my word. Sabrina moved to bridge the gap, her hand sliding up to my shoulder. "But you won, Grant. You proved everyone wrong. Doesn't that feel good?" "No," I said. "It feels like an audit." I gently moved her hand and stepped back. A man like Derek is easy to understand. He's all surface. He's a system with no depth. But you're the person I'm supposed to trust with the load-bearing walls of my life. And tonight, you didn't just invite a guest into our home. You invited a wrecking ball. Grant, you're overthinking this. You're being analytical again. She tried to laugh, but it sounded thin. I'm an analyst, Sabrina. It's what I do. I walked over to the counter and picked up the keys I'd set down hours ago. I looked at the kitchen, clean, modern, exactly the kind of place a comfortable doormat would live. Where are you going? She asked, the adrenaline finally starting to leak out of her voice, replaced by a sudden, sharp edge of fear. I'm going to stay at a hotel, I said. I need to run the numbers on this. I need to see if there's anything left in this structure that hasn't been compromised. Over a party? Over Derek? Over the fact that my wife thinks a quiet life is a defect, I said. I walked to the front door. I didn't look back to see her standing barefoot in the kitchen. I didn't need to. I already had the data. As I pulled out of the driveway, I thought of Brooke's face in the doorway. I thought about the kind of woman who values the person behind the calm, not just the storm that follows it. I drove through the quiet streets of Columbus, the engine humming, a steady, controlled, and completely reliable sound. The test was over. Everyone had passed except the person I needed to. The divorce wasn't a battle, it was a liquidation. Sabrina spent the first month oscillating between tearful apologies and frantic justifications. She tried to frame the party as a wake-up call that had simply gone wrong, promising there would be no more games or tests. But I'm an analyst. I look at the data, not the sales pitch. Once you realize the person who should be guarding your back is actually the one setting the traps, the system is compromised beyond repair. I didn't want to spend the next 30 years wondering which Tuesday would be the next performance. Trust isn't something you can patch once the structural integrity is gone. I didn't argue. I didn't perform a scene. I just filed the paperwork and moved into a quiet space where the only noise was the kind I chose. A few weeks after the final papers were signed, I sat in my car and looked at my phone. I thought about the night of the party. Not the arm wrestling or the posturing, but the woman who had stood in a windy parking lot just to make sure I wasn't walking into a room blind. Brooke was the only person in that circle who operated from a moral framework that didn't involve an audience. I pulled up her contact info and typed a short message. I'm finally settled in. You mentioned a coffee place near High Street a while back. Is it still worth the trip? She replied in less than a minute. It is the best in the city. I am free Thursday if you want a guide. I felt a small, genuine pull of something in my chest. Not the frantic electricity Sabrina lived for, but something steady, something load-bearing. Thursday works, I wrote back. See you then. I put the phone down, checked my watch, and headed home. No alarms, no surprises. Just the quiet confidence of a man who finally knew exactly what he was building.